close your eyes. You are in Jerusalem a few days after Easter. The air inside the house is heavy, hot, still, as if even the wind is afraid to enter. The wooden door is locked from the inside. The closing bar presses against the fittings with a dry, harsh sound, and every little noise from the street makes your entire body tense. Outside, the city still pulses with pilgrims, vendors, animals, dust, and soldiers. But inside, everything has shrunk. The world now fits in a dark room, in short breaths, in eyes that avoid meeting each other for a long time. The light comes from small, flickering flames. Oil lamps burn slowly, leaving the acrid smell of soot mixed with sweat, damp fabric, and old wood in the air. Archaeologists discovered that first-century Jewish homes in Jerusalem often used limestone walls, simple floors, and limestone vessels associated with ritual purity. Evidence suggests that environments like this were cramped, functional, closed against the heat of the day, and in moments of crisis, also closed against terror. You can almost touch the roughness of the wall with your fingertips. Cold, irregular, real. And the fear here is real. It is not abstract fear. It is not a religious, distant, symbolic fear. It's the fear of being next. You've seen what Rome does to bodies. You heard the screams. You smelled dried blood and wood exposed to the sun. You know what happens to someone who is associated with someone convicted of sedition. Crucifixion was not just execution. It was public notice. It was calculated humiliation. It was an empire preaching a message on a man's body. No one defies Caesar and remains alive. But that's not all. What makes this room even more suffocating isn't just the threat outside, it's confusion inside. Because the tomb is empty, because some voices swear they saw him, because others don't know what to think, because a hope, when it returns too soon, can hurt almost as much as grief. And now, you are caught between two impossibilities. If he is not resurrected, everything is over. If he was resurrected, then everything you understood about reality is gone too. Take a closer look. No one in that room looks heroic. No one is in a position to conquer. There is no victory song. There is no triumphal march. There are shaken men, women marked by haste and loss, restless hands, tired faces, memories that still burn. The resurrection, in these first moments, does not come first as a celebration. It comes as a shock, like tremor, like a truth too big for a heart, still locked away. And that's exactly where it all begins, not in strength, but in ruin, not in courage, but behind closed doors, not in certainties, but in the heavy silence of people who are still trying to understand what came next. Now imagine the morning after the shock. The removed stone did not bring immediate relief. It brought disorder. Jerusalem continues to stand. The temple continues to receive people. The priests continue their rituals. The soldiers continue to patrol the pale limestone streets, and yet something invisible seems to have gone astray. You feel it in the way people speak more quietly, in the way news spreads and arrives distorted, in the way no one can distinguish rumors from miracles. The tomb is empty. That's the brute fact. But brute fact is not the same as understanding. The first witnesses do not return with an easy-to-absorb account. They return breathless, emotional, broken between tears and astonishment. They say the stone has been removed. They say the body wasn't there. They say there were messengers. They say he lives. And the reaction is not an explosion of collective faith. It's hesitation. It's silence. It's that look of someone who wants to believe but knows the price of believing too soon. Because hope can humiliate those who give into it and then discover that they got it all wrong. Evidence suggests that first-century Jewish tombs around Jerusalem were rock-cut, with internal burial benches and, in many cases, niches or ossuaries used in secondary burials. Archaeologists discovered tombs of this type on the outskirts of the city, confirming an important detail. The scene of the resurrection does not belong to the field of nebulous myth, but to the physical world of carved stone, funerary linen, the cramped space where death was treated with ritual and haste, especially on the eve of a Sabbath or festival. This makes the emptiness even more disturbing. It is not the disappearance of an idea. It is the absence of a body in a real place. But there's an even greater tension running beneath it all. The disciples did not expect a resurrection in the middle of history. Many Jews from the Second Temple period believed in resurrection, yes, but as a future, collective event linked to the end of times and God's judgment. No one was prepared for a man killed on Friday to turn up alive on Sunday while Rome was still ruling, while the temple was still worked, while the world apparently remained the same. And that changes everything, because it is not enough to accept that Jesus lives. It is necessary to accept that the very structure of time has been torn, and almost no one can do it right away. What most people feel first is not conviction, it's conflict, because the cross had crushed the common messianic expectation. The Messiah, for many, should win, purify, restore, govern, not to die exposed, bloodied, ridiculed. The crucifixion seemed like a public denial of everything. Rome didn't just kill Jesus. Rome tried to prove in front of everyone that the hope placed in him was a mistake. And now, with the tomb empty, the pieces don't fit together. Not yet. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the biggest difficulty wasn't the lack of signs, but the human inability to recognize a work of God when it doesn't look like what we had imagined? You feel this conflict in the bodies of those who heard the news. Some run, some stop, some repeat the women's words with suspicion, some want proof, others can't even formulate what they feel. The grief is still too fresh. The memory of Friday still pulses through my nerves. The sound of hammers, the crowd, the darkened sky, the collapse of everything in a few hours. And now, someone says, he lives. But living after seeing a tortured corpse seems too absurd. This is why these first few days after the resurrection are not a clean sequence of hallelujahs. These are days of cognitive shock, of faith colliding with trauma, of biblical memory trying to reach a reality that arrived before it was understood. The empty tomb doesn't solve everything at once. It ushers in a crisis, a holy crisis, a rupture so profound that even those closest to us need time to cross it. And the most surprising thing is this: Christianity is not born from people ready to believe in anything. It is born from people resisting, trembling, struggling to accept the impossible, even when it has already happened before them. Feel the weight of this room on your chest. The problem was not just that Jesus had died. The problem was the way it all happened. Too fast, too public, too violent. In Jerusalem, under Roman rule, death was not just pain. It was political language. Crucifixion was imperial theater. The body was exposed so that fear could enter the survivors and take up residence. And now he entered. He is sitting with you in that room. It is in prolonged silence. It's in the way no one moves without need. It's in the way a louder voice makes everyone look up at the same time. You try to take a deep breath, but the air feels short. There is still dust on the sandals. There is still dry sweat on his tunic. There is still in my memory the climb to the place of execution, the noise of the crowd, the movement of soldiers, the metallic odor of blood mixed with the gross smell of leather, wood, and a hot street. Evidence suggests that the Roman military presence in Jerusalem increased greatly during the high festivals, especially Easter, when the city received crowds and the risk of unrest grew. This means that the disciples' fear was not an emotional exaggeration. It was a calculation of survival. An executed leader could be the start of a sweep. And then comes the most human part of all, guilt. Pedro is not just scared. He is broken inside. It's not just the trauma of the cross. It's the memory of one's own voice denying it. It's the sound of the rooster crossing the dawn like a blade. It is the look of Jesus, not as a theatrical condemnation, but as a truth that is impossible to avoid. Some there fled, others hid, others watched from afar. Everyone in some way knows they failed, and when guilt mixes with grief, the heart begins to build cells where no one can see. But this raises a question that almost no one faces. How do you welcome back someone you abandoned in their darkest hour? Look around this enclosed space. Don't see apostles as icons painted in gold. See exhausted men. See swollen eyes from sleepless nights. See hands tightening robes, knees drawn in, jaws tense. Archaeologists discovered that many first-century domestic spaces in Jerusalem were multifunctional, with modest rooms, jar storage, oil lamps, stone utensils, and little privacy. This means that suffering there had no stage. There was no aesthetic distance. The fear was shared very closely. Pain smells when many people suffer in the same environment. And women carry another type of wound. They went to the tomb. They walked with their bodies still weighed down by recent mourning, probably carrying funeral aromas, as was the Jewish custom. It is known from the context of the period that spices and ointments were used to care for the dead when time and purity laws permitted. They went to serve a corpse. They went to finish with a goodbye, and they found the impossible. But even that hurts, because when the world breaks before your eyes, the soul doesn't celebrate first. First, she staggers. And no one there yet has a theology ready to organize the chaos. This is the detail that many miss. The disciples were not living a beautiful devotional moment. They were experiencing neurological, emotional, and spiritual disorientation. The body reacts to trauma before the mind can interpret hope. The stomach closes. Sleep comes broken. Small sounds sound like threats. Memories come back in flashes. And in the midst of all this comes the most absurd news in history. He is not dead, but their body still acts like Friday never ended. Maybe that's why this moment is so close to you, because there are pains that continue in the nervous system even when God has already started to do something new. There are doors that remain locked even after the miracle. There are people who deeply love Jesus and yet trembled inside. What happened to those disciples was not just an old chapter, it was a revelation about human frailty. You may have seen signs, heard promises, carried sacred memories, and still feel paralyzed when fear touches the most sensitive part of you. And here's what changes everything. The first days after the resurrection were not populated by spiritual giants immune to collapse. They were inhabited by people too injured to feign strength. People trying to understand if there was still a future after failure, after shame, after what their eyes could never forget. And precisely in this environment saturated with fear, guilt, and memories that burned inside, something began to approach, not outside, from within their own ruin. And then it happens, not with trumpets, not with a kneeling crowd, not with Rome collapsing in a single night. The first great rupture of the resurrection takes place inside a closed room among men who are still afraid. The doors remain locked. The wooden bar remains in place. The light from the lamps continues to flicker against the stone walls. The smell of burning oil, sweat, and stuffy air is still there. Nothing in the environment suggests triumph. Nothing seems ready for glory. And that's exactly why the moment hurts so deeply. Suddenly, he's there. Not as a souvenir, not as a collective hallucination, not as inner consolation. There, present, close enough to be seen, heard, observed. The resurrected one does not wait for the environment to improve before entering. He doesn't wait for courage to return. He does not require that their faith be organized. He enters while fear is still in the room. And that breaks almost everyone's expectations, because we imagine that the resurrection should instantly erase the panic. But what the Gospels show is something stranger, more beautiful and more human. Jesus does not first remove the scene of fragility. It reveals itself within him. But look closer. The first word is not reprimand. It's not, "Why did you run away?" It's not, "Now do you believe?" It's peace. In a first-century Jewish world, greetings of peace were common. But here, the word comes loaded with an almost unbearable density. Peace not as a formality. Peace as divine invasion into a collapsing nervous system. Evidence suggests that Jewish communities of that period used expressions of peace as a relational and spiritual blessing. But here, the word cuts across the room in direct response to terror, guilt, and confusion. He speaks peace to men who have no peace within themselves. And that's not all. He shows the wounds. This detail changes everything. The resurrected one does not appear to erase the signs of violence as if redemption were the forgetting of pain. It still appears marked. The hands, the side, the glorified body does not deny the cross. He carries her transfigured. What most people miss is this. The resurrection was not a simple return to the previous life. It was God's victory going through death without pretending that death didn't happen. Archaeologists discovered nails, crucifixion remains, and physical evidence of Roman terror in burials of the period, reminding us that crucifixion left real marks on real flesh. When Jesus shows his wounds, he is saying without saying, "It is I, the same one. Death has truly touched me, and yet it did not hold me back." That's why their joy doesn't explode as an immediate spectacle. She is born in shock, in reverence, in trembling unbelief to become worship. Because at that moment, the impossible is no longer outside like a rumor. The impossible is breathing in the same space as them. And here is the revelation that changes the entire scene. The first encounter with the resurrected Christ takes place not in an open field of trust, but in a room full of locked doors. This means that his presence does not depend on the opening you can offer. He is able to get into that fear still rules. It crosses what you swore would protect you and turns a hiding place into a meeting place. That's how it started, not with men ready to change the world, but with the new world silently entering the room where they were hiding. You're not looking at a comfortable skeptic. You are looking at a wounded man. Thomas is often remembered as the disciple of doubt, almost as if his story were just a lesson in unbelief. But that oversimplifies what happened, because doubt, in those first days after the resurrection, was not intellectual coldness. It was the reflection of a soul that had been pushed to the limit. It was what was left when hope had been crushed in the public square, and suddenly someone said that the impossible had happened. To a grieving heart, the news of the resurrection does not immediately sound like comfort. Sometimes it sounds like a risk. Imagine the weight of that inside your body. Thomas had not seen what others saw. He was not in the room at the time when Jesus appeared and spoke peace. And now he has to deal with the testimony of men as shaken as he is. Men who days before were hidden, confused, ashamed, terrified. Men he loves, yes, but who also carry the same trauma. So what does he do? He demands contact. It requires proximity. It requires wounds. He wants to see the marks. He wants to touch the place where death left its signature. That doesn't sound like pride. It feels like exhaustion. It sounds like someone saying, I can no longer give my heart to a hope that might destroy me again. And that reveals something deeply human. In the first century Jewish world, testimony was important, but extraordinary experiences still needed to be seriously discerned. Biblical faith was never designed to be empty credulity. Evidence suggests that Jewish communities valued visible signs, witnesses, and communal memory as ways of confirming decisive events. Thomas is not necessarily rejecting God. He is trying to emotionally survive the possibility of false joy. And who can blame him? After the cross, even hope could seem cruel. But here's the point that almost everyone misses. Thomas does not doubt in a vacuum. He doubts among the community. He's still close. It continues between them. Keep listening, even without being able to surrender yet. That matters. Because there is a difference between rejecting and fighting. There is a difference between cynicism and pain. What most people miss is this. Some of the deepest doubts are born not from distance from God, but from the fear of approaching Him again after having been broken. Thomas represents that part of the human soul that needs time, that cannot run to the most beautiful conclusion while the chest still bleeds inside. And then Jesus comes back 8 days later. This detail matters because it shows waiting, shows process. It shows that not all restoration happens in the first instant. The doors are closed again, the atmosphere is still one of recollection, and Jesus appears again. But now the focus is on the man who couldn't believe the speed of others, and what Jesus does is devastating in its tenderness. He does not humiliate Thomas. He does not expose him to ridicule. It does not transform its fragility into a moral spectacle. He approaches doubt with the same wounds that had already healed the fear of others. Watch the scene calmly. Hands still marked, the side still marked. The resurrected offering precisely what Thomas said he needed. Not an abstraction, not a scolding, a verifiable presence. Archaeologists discovered physical evidence of Roman brutality and executions of the period, reminding us that crucifixion wounds were not symbolic. They were concrete, deep, unforgettable. And that is precisely why this moment has so much power. Jesus responds to doubt, not by erasing the marks, but by showing the marks. And there, the doubt collapses. Not because Thomas was defeated by a brilliant argument, but because he was overtaken by a presence that knew exactly the shape of his resistance. The confession that emerges from there is not born of social pressure. It is born from the encounter, and it changes the way you read the entire story. Because Tomei is not the villain of the group. Tomei is the mirror of almost everyone. He is the part of us that wants to believe, but trembles. The part that loves, but protects itself. The part that needs to be sure that hope is not just a more sophisticated form of denial. And perhaps that's why his story has endured. Because the first days after the resurrection were not just made up of collective fear, but also silent internal struggles. Not everyone runs at the same speed to faith. Not everyone can interpret grace at the same moment. Some need the resurrected Christ to pass through not only closed doors, but also defense mechanisms erected within the soul. And when he does that, the doubt is no longer the end of the story. It becomes the place where revelation touches the deepest. Now fear is beginning to lose ground, but not all at once. Not like explosion, not like a suddenly invincible mob. What comes after the resurrection is slower, more intimate, more human than many people imagine. These are not just appearances. There are 40 days of reconstruction, 40 days in which Jesus not only proves that he is alive, but reorganizes men and women inside who had been dismantled by the cross. Think about it calmly. The empty tomb was the shock. The appearances were the breakthrough. But these next few days were restoration. And restoration rarely happens in an instant. It happens in conversations, in meals, in walks, in pauses, in silences, filled with the right presence. You can almost feel the rhythm of these days. The sun rising over the Judean hills, the dust from the roads clinging to your sandals, the murmur of the villages, the sound of water being drawn, bread being broken, fish being cooked over hot coals. The resurrected one does not appear just to impress. He shows up to do it again. Evidence suggests that shared meals were one of the centers of Jewish social life in the first century, marking covenant, communion, and identity. This makes the fact that Jesus ate with them after he was resurrected even more profound. He is not offering an abstract idea of survival after death. He is sitting again in the space of human intimacy. The resurrected Christ chews, speaks, waits, listens. The miracle is not limited to the triumph over the tomb. The miracle continues in the way he returns to inhabit the daily lives of his family. But that's not all. These 40 days are also a reading school, because the disciples didn't just need to see Jesus live. They needed to understand what his life, death, and resurrection meant. They needed to reread Moses, the Psalms, the prophets. They needed to realize that God's story had not failed on the cross, had passed exactly the place where they thought it all ended. What most people miss is this: the resurrection does not just solve the problem of death. It reinterprets the entire narrative. Now imagine their eyes opening little by little. Ancient texts that once seemed distant begin to pulse. The suffering servant, the righteous rejected, the promised king, the wounded pastor, the Son of Man, not as loose pieces, but as an entire drawing finally illuminated. Archaeologists discovered manuscripts, synagogal practices, and textual traditions from the Second Temple period that show how much the scriptures were at the center of Jewish life. So, when Jesus opens the scriptures to his followers, he is not giving a decorative lesson. It's reconfiguring their mental universe. He is teaching these men to recognize that God has already spoken about glory passing through suffering, victory passing through apparent defeat, life emerging from the most unlikely place. And meanwhile, something else happens. Their body begins to learn what the soul is still trying to achieve. The same Peter who trembled before a servant now sits again before Jesus. The same group that hid behind closed doors now experiences repeated encounters with a presence that cannot be reduced to rumor. Fear does not disappear by decree. It is being moved. Each encounter pushes the shadow a little further back. Every word of Jesus puts the bones back out of place. Each shared meal says without saying, the relationship did not end in your failure. And this touches on a deeply human point, because what destroys a person is not always just the suffering they went through. Sometimes it is the interpretation she makes of herself after suffering. Peter didn't just need to know that Jesus was alive. I needed to find out if there was still a place for him after the denial. The others didn't just need physical proof. They needed to know if their failure had ended the vocation they once received. These 40 days are also about this, not just the victory of Christ, but the reintegration of the broken. And then the mission begins to emerge, not yet as a public spectacle, but as an internal flame. Jesus speaks of the kingdom, it speaks of the Father's promise, it speaks of the Spirit. Talk about testimony from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And here comes one of the greatest turning points in history. Men who a few days ago just wanted to survive now begin to hear words that are too big for their former size. Their world was locked in a room. Now their mind is pushed to the nations. But notice the method. Jesus doesn't build this with power alone, builds with repeated presence, with patience, with explanation, with proximity, eating with them, talking to them, letting time be used as a healing instrument. This breaks the modern expectation of instant transformation. The resurrected one could simply have appeared given in undeniable glory to all, crushing all resistance in a single moment. But choose a more relational, slower, deeper path. He forms witnesses before releasing messengers. And that might be the most important part of all, because what came after the resurrection was not just a proof of life, it was the recreation of a community born of fear, purified by truth, sustained by presence, and prepared for something it couldn't even measure yet. 40 days in which Jesus takes emotionally misaligned people and begins to return them to themselves, only now crossed by a new reality. Not just that death was conquered, but that nothing would ever be common again. The empty tomb shook their world, but it was these days with the resurrected one that began to rebuild it. And then you realize that perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't just the empty tomb. Yes, the removed stone changes history. Yes, defeated death tears apart the logic of the world. But there's something else going on, quieter and perhaps even more disconcerting. Men are changing, not in a theatrical way, not like legendary characters who never felt afraid, but like real people, slowly ripped from survival and thrust into a previously unthinkable mission. And that in itself would be inexplicable, because terrified men don't usually become steadfast witnesses. Men who hide behind locked doors do not usually, a few weeks later, publicly support a message capable of putting them on a collision course with religious authorities and imperial power. Men crushed by guilt do not usually recover voice, clarity, and moral firmness to this depth, unless something or someone has remade them from the inside. What most people miss is this: the evidence of the resurrection is not just in the empty tomb, but in the type of people who began to emerge after it. Look at Peter again, the man who collapsed around a fire, cornered by a servant's question, did not disappear. It was rebuilt. And true reconstruction does not erase memory. redeems memory. The same mouth that denied it now begins to carry the truth. The same heart that collapsed now learns firmness. This does not mean that fear never touched these men again. It means that fear is no longer master. And that is a huge difference, because biblical courage is not the absence of trembling. It is fidelity that remains even when the body still remembers what it is like to tremble. Evidence suggests that messianic movements in the first century Jewish world typically dissolved when their leader died, especially under Roman execution. The logic was simple. If Rome crucified the man, Rome won the claim. The group dispersed, the memory weakened, the project died together. But here the opposite happens. Instead of dissolution, there is consolidation. Instead of permanent silence, there is proclamation. Instead of an end, there is expansion. Historically, this requires explanation. And the explanation is not that the disciples were naturally extraordinary. They were not brilliant strategists mounting an influence campaign. They were not political elites. They were not emotionally armored men. Archaeologists discovered, through the material context of first-century Galilee and Judea, a world of ordinary workers, fishermen, artisans, families living under fiscal, religious, and imperial pressure. It is from this human fabric that the nascent Christian movement emerges. Ordinary people, vulnerable people, people who bleed, hesitate, retreat, and yet end up carrying a conviction greater than the instinct of self-preservation, and that leads to an uncomfortable revelation. Perhaps the power of the resurrection is not just to prove that Jesus is alive, but to prove that a life touched by him can never remain the old way again. This is where the story stops being just theirs and starts touching you, because there is a difference between being alive and just surviving. The disciples in the early days were surviving, breathing short, hiding, calculating risk, managing trauma. But Jesus did not rise just to be admired from a distance. He was resurrected to uproot his followers from this narrow, compressed, defensive mode of existence. He doesn't just console, he commissions. It doesn't just calm down, it redirects. It doesn't just heal the wound, it returns purpose. And perhaps this is the hardest turn to accept, because surviving seems safer than being sent away. But those men begin to discover something that changes everything. Being locked up no longer suits those who have seen the resurrected. Fear still whispers, yes. The memory of the cross still exists, yes. Roman power is still there, yes. And yet something bigger begins to pulse within them. Not arrogance, not empty euphoria. Presence converted into mission. The kind of conviction that is born when someone realizes that and the worst possible thing has already happened. And yet, God went through it and won. Now take a deep breath and go back to that room once again. The door is still closed. The air still feels heavy. The memories haven't disappeared yet. The emotional wounds have not yet all been organized. And yet, something changed forever. Not because the disciples finally became strong on their own, not because the world around has become safe, not because Rome disappeared, but because the resurrected Christ entered exactly the place where they were most locked up. And maybe that's what makes this story so dangerous, because it doesn't allow you to treat the resurrection as a beautiful, distant, decorative symbol. It forces you to see it as an invasion, like interruption, like God's entry into the very place where fear seemed to have taken up permanent residence. What most people miss is this. The first days after the resurrection, don't just reveal what happened to Jesus. They reveal what Jesus does with people who no longer know how to move forward. Evidence suggests, through the very structure of the earliest accounts, that Christian faith was born not of instant emotional triumph, but of repeated encounters with the risen one in the midst of fragility, doubt, and trauma. This means that Christian hope was not built on invulnerable people. It was built on visited people, remade people, people called out of the place where they were hiding, and here history touches you. Because perhaps your problem is not a total lack of faith. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's a disappointment that still left the door closed from the inside. Maybe you still love Jesus, but somewhere in your soul, you continue to live as if Friday never ended. Keep taking short breaths. Keep protecting yourself. Keep surviving when you were called to live, but the resurrection asks a question that no one can avoid forever. What in you is still locked away? What fear still rules the room? What pain still interprets your future? What guilt still speaks louder than grace? And which part of your life needs to be visited by the Christ who enters even when the doors remain closed? Because that's what came later. Not just an empty tomb, not just surprising reports, but men and women being pulled out of paralysis and returned to the mission. Ordinary people, wounded, hesitant, transformed by the living presence of Jesus. If this itinerary made you feel the weight and beauty of these first days after the resurrection, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that God still enters closed places. And tell me in the comments, honestly, which door in your life do you most need Jesus to walk through today?